The man I was supposed to marry stole my life savings to fund a business with his secret lover. He thought I'd be left with nothing, but he never realized I was the only thing holding his entire career together. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember the day like it happened yesterday. The room was bright with the soft morning sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the warmth outside contrasted sharply with the cold knot forming in my stomach. I was sitting at the long, polished conference table, meticulously prepared to present a project I had been working on for months. Every chart, every slide, every word had been triple-checked, triple-edited, triple-rehearsed. And yet, as soon as I began speaking, my boss, Mark, decided this was the perfect moment to humiliate me. He didn't wait. A smirk crossed his face, one I had seen often but had never associated with such malice. "Really? This is what you came up with?" He scoffed, laughing loudly, and I could feel every client in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. The laughter wasn't just a reaction, it was a weapon aimed squarely at me. It was meant to wound. And it did. The words he used weren't subtle. Amateur, inept, hopeless. Each one landed like a cold, sharp blow. I forced myself to keep my composure, my fingers gripping the edge of the table until they whitened. I could feel my face heating, my throat tightening, but I refused to let him see me break. There was a strange duality in that moment. Part of me wanted to sink into my chair and disappear, and another part burned with a determination that shocked even me. This wasn't the first time Mark had mocked me in front of colleagues, but this was different. The audience wasn't just internal staff or casual peers. This was a room full of clients who could easily question my competence, and, by extension, the company's. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, suffocating, making my chest tighten. That laughter, that pointed mockery, was more than just cruel. It was dangerous. In that instant, I realized two things with absolute clarity. First, Mark didn't just want to assert authority, he wanted to humiliate. It was a calculated act, one designed to make me feel small and powerless. And second, this time, it wasn't something I could shrug off. Not anymore. Something had shifted. The old, patient, accommodating part of me, the part that had tolerated small slights and dismissive comments for months, knew that line had been crossed. As I continued my presentation, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I would finish the presentation. I always finished what I started. But a plan, a quiet, simmering determination began to form in my mind. I would not let this moment define me. I would not let him walk away thinking he had won. I glanced around the room, taking in the client's expressions, polite smiles, averted eyes, hints of discomfort. In that subtle reaction, I found both encouragement and urgency. The situation was dire, but it was also an opportunity. And I promised myself right then that I would turn this humiliation into a reckoning. Little did I know, that day would mark the beginning of a journey that would test my patience, sharpen my cunning, and ultimately allow me to deliver a justice so perfectly ironic that Mark would never recover. The seed of my plan had been planted in that moment, in the shadow of his laughter, and once it took root, nothing would stop it from growing. Before the incident with Mark, my life at work had been challenging, yes, but manageable. I had always been diligent, detail-oriented, and quietly ambitious. I prided myself on my reliability. Colleagues often sought me out for guidance on projects, and I had built a reputation for being steady, thoughtful, and solution-focused. I wasn't looking for praise or recognition, just the respect that comes with doing your job well. That was my normal world, the rhythm of daily work. Emails, meetings, client calls, and careful planning. It wasn't glamorous, but it was predictable and safe. Mark, on the other hand, was the kind of boss who thrived on control and intimidation. His charm could be impressive when he wanted to impress clients or upper management, but behind closed doors, his demeanor was entirely different. He had a sharp tongue, a quick temper, and a talent for belittling anyone who threatened his ego, real or imagined. I had learned early on that his feedback was often laced with personal digs, and though I tried to shrug it off, It left an invisible mark every time. In the early months of working together, I had even tried to see the positive side. Perhaps he was just high-strung under pressure, or maybe he pushed people hard because he cared about results. I thought that if I worked efficiently, kept my head down, and stayed professional, I could navigate around his volatile tendencies. But the more I observed him, the more I realized his behavior wasn't situational. It was systemic. He didn't merely criticize, he weaponized humiliation as a daily tool, making himself feel superior by making others feel small. Despite that, I kept my distance, maintained professionalism, and focused on my work. I knew my value, and I knew the quality of the projects I delivered. My coworkers respected me quietly, though few would openly challenge Mark for fear of becoming his next target. There were moments when I felt isolated, yes, but I also recognized that I had built a foundation of competence and credibility that would be impossible for him to discredit entirely. The clients, too, were important in this dynamic. They trusted me, and I took that trust seriously. I knew that every interaction, every presentation, was an opportunity to reinforce my professionalism and protect the company's reputation. Mark, however, seemed almost to delight in undermining that trust, inserting himself into my presentations with sarcastic asides or mocking commentary that cast doubt on my expertise. His behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous, not only for me personally, but for the work and the relationships I had cultivated carefully. Despite this tension, there were still moments of routine and calm in my day-to-day life. I had coworkers who were supportive and understanding, though cautious. I had clients who appreciated my thoroughness. I had small victories that reminded me why I kept showing up, even under Mark's oppressive shadow. This balance, however delicate, was the last sense of normal I would feel before everything escalated beyond tolerable limits. And then, of course, came the moment that would shatter that fragile equilibrium. The day he laughed at me in front of the clients. That day made it impossible to ignore the toxicity of his behavior any longer. The baseline of my normal world had been destroyed, leaving me with a stark choice: continue to endure, silently collecting scars, or confront the situation with the precision and intelligence it demanded. It was in that moment, reflecting on months of small humiliations, that I recognized the clear pattern. Mark's arrogance and cruelty had created openings, weaknesses, and most importantly, leverage, if I could only find the right way to use it. The ordinary rhythm of my life was gone, replaced by a sense of urgency and purpose I had never felt before. The foundation of my professional existence, competence, reliability, and credibility, became my armor. And it was from this vantage point that I began to consider my next move. The moment Mark crossed the line wasn't dramatic in a cinematic sense. There were no explosions, no sudden revelations. But in the quiet, polished conference room, amidst the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft shuffling of papers, it felt seismic. That day, he did not merely critique my work. He humiliated me in a way that was personal, public, and inescapable. I had prepared a presentation for a high-profile client, one that represented weeks of meticulous planning, research, and careful coordination with multiple departments. I entered the room with my laptop balanced on the sleek table, slides queued up, voice steady despite the lingering anxiety I always felt before a big meeting. This should have been my moment to shine, to demonstrate the value of my work and reinforce the trust I had cultivated with the clients over the past year. Instead, Mark saw it as an opportunity to assert dominance. As I began to speak, he leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk and let out a sharp laugh, cutting across my opening remarks. "Really? This is what you're presenting?" His voice carried throughout the room, loud enough for clients and colleagues alike to feel the sting of his derision. The clients shifted uneasily, some exchanging glances that betrayed their discomfort. I felt every eye weigh on me, measuring, judging, and I knew they weren't just assessing my work. They were watching me, trying to gauge whether I would crumble under his ridicule. Mark didn't stop there. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, eyes glinting with satisfaction. I don't know why I even bother. It's almost laughable how amateur this is. The words were precise, designed to wound. I forced myself to keep breathing evenly, to maintain a calm exterior, though inside, a storm of frustration and indignation swirled. I could feel the familiar heat creeping into my cheeks, the tightness in my chest that came with public embarrassment, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. As he continued, I noticed something that I had missed in earlier encounters. He wasn't just laughing at my work, he was performing. This was a spectacle for the clients, a carefully choreographed display meant to assert his superiority and reinforce his image as the only competent authority in the room. That realization made the humiliation even sharper. He wasn't just trying to embarrass me, he was trying to manipulate everyone else's perception of me, turning the moment into a strategic weapon. Something inside me shifted then. I realized that this wasn't a minor slight or an isolated incident. This was a pattern, and he had just made it glaringly public. The thought of letting him walk away unchallenged, of allowing his arrogance to overshadow months of hard work, ignited. A determination that surprised me even as it burned. I knew in that instant that I couldn't just endure this. I couldn't remain passive and hope it would pass. Something had to change, and I would be the one to make it happen. As I finished the presentation, careful, precise, measured, I felt eyes on me, assessing whether I would respond. I didn't. I let the last slide fade, closed my laptop, and offered a polite, professional smile. Inside, however, my mind was already racing, analyzing every detail of Mark's behavior, replaying the laughter, the mockery, the precise way he sought to humiliate me. Each moment became a building block in a mental blueprint of what I would need to do next. By the time the meeting ended, the clients had left with polite nods and polite smiles, but the sting of Mark's cruelty lingered. It was clear to me that this was no longer a matter of simple workplace annoyance. This was an ethical, professional, and personal violation. He had publicly undermined my credibility, my expertise, and my dignity. And in doing so, he had provided me with the motivation, the clarity, and the evidence I would need to take action. That day, as I returned to my office and closed the door behind me, a cold, hard resolve settled in my chest. The line had been crossed. The decision was made. I would not allow this behavior to continue unchecked, and I would ensure that when the dust settled, Mark would face the consequences of his arrogance and cruelty. Consequences as undeniable and precise as the humiliation he had inflicted upon me. After that fateful meeting, it seemed Mark took my silence as permission to escalate his behavior. What had once been occasional jabs and undermining comments evolved into a relentless campaign of humiliation. Every day felt like navigating a minefield where one misstep, or even a breath, could trigger his sharp tongue and cutting laughter. It began subtly at first. He would interrupt me mid-sentence in team meetings, correcting me in ways that made my expertise appear amateurish. He made casual remarks about my lack of initiative or inexperience, fully aware that others in the room would hear them. At first, I tried to ignore these digs, reminding myself that his words were empty and that I had the results to prove my value. But the repeated assaults started to weigh on me, gnawing at my confidence, even when I knew intellectually that he was wrong. Then came the more blatant attempts to take credit for my work. In client presentations and internal reports, he would position my ideas as if they were his own, framing my meticulous efforts as minor contributions that needed his correction to become acceptable. I watched as the clients nodded politely, assuming that the polished, coherent solutions I had spent weeks developing were, in fact, Mark's brilliance. The betrayal stung, sharper than any insult, because he was actively erasing my achievements in front of those who mattered most. The worst part was the laughter. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in pointing out flaws, no matter how minor, while I struggled to maintain composure. He treated my efforts like a joke, a public display designed to diminish me not just in my own eyes, but in the eyes of everyone around. Even colleagues who had once shown quiet support began to tread carefully, afraid of drawing his ire themselves. It was a perfect storm. Isolation, humiliation, and professional sabotage all rolled into one. Despite all this, I kept my calm. I refused to react impulsively, to show anger or frustration. I knew Mark thrived on provocation. Any visible reaction would only fuel his sense of superiority. Instead, I observed. I listened. I noted patterns in his behavior, times when he overreached, moments when he misrepresented facts, and occasions when he revealed his own arrogance and carelessness. Each instance was a piece of evidence, a building block for the strategy I would quietly craft. The escalation continued relentlessly. One day, during a particularly important client call, he interrupted me repeatedly, laughed at my suggestions, and even contradicted information I knew to be accurate, just to make me appear incompetent. The clients shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and I could sense their growing uncertainty. I felt my stomach tighten, a familiar knot of frustration and righteous indignation forming. In that moment, I realized that waiting for someone else to intervene was pointless. HR would not act unless there was indisputable proof, and the higher-ups would only notice if the damage became catastrophic. I had to take matters into my own hands. It was also in this period of constant undermining that I recognized the unique leverage I had: Mark's arrogance. He was so confident in his control over the room, over me, over the narrative, that he had no idea I was taking mental notes, cataloging every slight, every insult, every instance of professional misconduct. His overconfidence was my shield and my weapon. He never suspected that the quiet, composed employee he mocked was preparing to turn the tables with precision. By the time the week ended, the cumulative effect of his behavior had pushed me to the brink. I was no longer just enduring, I was preparing. I knew I needed a methodical, intelligent way to confront him with undeniable evidence. A way to ensure that when justice came, it would be final, complete, and perfectly suited to the cruelty he had inflicted. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the strategy was beginning to take shape in my mind. The breaking point arrived in a way that was both humiliating and infuriating. The kind of moment that crystallizes everything you've endured and forces a decision. It wasn't some shocking, catastrophic event. It was the cumulative effect of weeks of relentless undermining, belittling, and outright theft of my professional credibility. And yet, in that moment, the impact hit harder than any single insult before. It happened during another client meeting, one of the most important of the quarter. I had prepared extensively, anticipating questions and aligning my data with the client's strategic goals. I entered the room with calm professionalism, determined to demonstrate competence and poise despite the tension that had been building over the previous weeks. But Mark had other plans. As soon as I began my presentation, he leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk already forming on his face. Midway through my explanation, he interrupted, laughing sharply, and said, "I don't know why you even try. This is barely competent work." The clients shifted uneasily, exchanging subtle glances, unsure whether to intervene or to pretend nothing was happening. My heart sank, not because I doubted myself, but because I realized that, once again, Mark was controlling the narrative, making me appear incapable in a room full of witnesses. That moment was different from the others, though. There was an edge to his cruelty this time, a sense that he wasn't just mocking me for amusement, but attempting to sabotage my credibility entirely. The sting of betrayal was palpable. Months of effort, dedication, and careful planning dismissed in a few cruel words. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach, the familiar anxiety mixing with something new. Clarity. I realized I could no longer endure this passively. I had tried patience, discretion, and quiet resilience, but Mark had taken advantage of every ounce of that tolerance. The humiliation had reached a threshold I could not ignore. I had to act, and I had to act strategically. There was no room for impulsive retaliation. That would only play into his hands. The solution needed to be calculated, intelligent, and undeniable. As I sat through the remainder of the meeting, a plan began to take shape in my mind. I knew Mark had a history of underestimating me, of assuming that I would remain compliant and silent. That arrogance, that overconfidence, would become my greatest advantage. I began mentally cataloging the moments he had crossed the line, the specific language he had used, the precise way he had attempted to undermine both me and the company's relationships with clients. By the time the meeting ended, I was certain of two things. First, that I needed a concrete way to prove his misconduct beyond a shadow of a doubt. And second, that I had the means to do it. I remembered that company policy allowed employees to record meetings for note-taking purposes. This wasn't widely advertised, but it had been mentioned in passing during an orientation session. Mark himself had even approved recording devices once, under the guise of facilitating meeting summaries. The realization hit me like a revelation. If I could document his behavior, capture his arrogance and cruelty in real time, I would have a weapon that couldn't be dismissed, disputed, or ignored. I wouldn't just be confronting him with accusations. I would be confronting him with undeniable evidence, evidence he had unknowingly provided through his own arrogance. That evening, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the week's meetings and interactions in my mind. Each insult, each act of undermining, each moment of blatant unprofessionalism became a piece of a puzzle. I could see the full pattern now, systematic, cruel, and entirely of his own making. And I knew that the next step would require patience, stealth, and meticulous attention to detail. I had reached my breaking point, but it wasn't a point of despair. It was a point of focus, of clarity, of decisive action. From that moment forward, I stopped seeing myself as a passive victim and began seeing myself as an agent of justice. The line had been crossed, the path was clear, and I was prepared to execute a plan that would not only protect my reputation, but ensure that Mark faced the consequences of his actions in a way that was both precise and perfectly deserved. Sitting, alone in my office that evening, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. I reviewed everything that had happened, the laughter, the interruptions, the relentless undermining, and the moments where Mark had arrogantly claimed credit for. My work? It all fit into a clear pattern, a trail of arrogance and cruelty that could no longer be ignored. And then I remembered something critical: the company policy allowing employees to record meetings for personal note-taking. I had never used it before, but in that moment, it became the cornerstone of my plan. If I could capture his behavior, every cruel remark, every belittling laugh, every instance where he sabotaged or misrepresented my work, I would have indisputable evidence. It wasn't just about retaliation, it was about justice. And the irony was delicious. The very arrogance that had emboldened him to humiliate me publicly would now become his undoing. The first step was simple, but required careful attention. I would start recording every meeting in which Mark attempted to belittle me or manipulate the narrative. This included client presentations, team meetings, and one-on-one reviews. I couldn't risk being obvious, so I set up my phone discreetly, ensuring it was positioned in a way that would capture his voice clearly without drawing attention. I also made sure my notes were precise, dates, times, locations, and context, so that the recordings would be impossible to dismiss as fabricated or misleading. Over the next several weeks, I systematically gathered evidence. I recorded him laughing at me during presentations, mocking my ideas, dismissing my expertise, and even taking credit for my work. Each recording was cataloged meticulously. The date, the meeting type, the participants, and a brief summary of what was captured. I also made copies immediately after each session, storing them securely in encrypted folders that only I could access. What I discovered as I reviewed these recordings was striking. Mark wasn't just occasionally cruel. His behavior was habitual, systematic, and unmistakably unprofessional. He often laughed at mistakes that didn't exist, deliberately interrupted me to undermine my authority, and used client-facing meetings as opportunities to assert dominance rather than to advance projects. The recordings revealed not only his arrogance, but also his disregard for both professional ethics and the company's reputation. With each new recording, my confidence grew. I could see a path forward where the evidence would be irrefutable. I wouldn't be relying on hearsay, rumors, or subjective interpretations. I had proof, captured in his own voice, in his own words, in the very settings where he sought to humiliate me. I realized that this approach was not only strategic, but deeply satisfying. The arrogance that had made him so careless, so confident that no one could challenge him, had created the perfect vulnerability. I also considered the timing. I needed to ensure that the presentation of evidence would have maximum impact. It couldn't be piecemeal or casual. It had to be organized, comprehensive, and undeniable. I began to prepare a structured approach for submitting the recordings to HR, complete with annotated highlights, contextual explanations, and a clear chronology that demonstrated the pattern of misconduct. Every detail mattered. The clarity of the evidence would determine whether the plan succeeded or faltered. Finally, I reminded myself of the stakes. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my dignity, protecting my professional reputation, and ensuring that Mark could not continue his toxic behavior unchecked. The recordings were my leverage, my unique weapon, but the real power lay in my strategic use of them. Patience, precision, and timing. I had learned from his mistakes and would not repeat them. He had left the door open, and I was ready to step through it. By the end of that week, my plan was fully formed. I had the evidence, the method, and the strategy. All that remained was execution. The sense of quiet anticipation that settled over me was like nothing I had felt before. I was no longer reacting to his cruelty. I was preparing to ensure it ended definitively, with consequences that would be impossible for him to deny. The unique weapon was in place, and the stage was set for justice to unfold. The day I decided to act, everything had to be precise. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for error. I arrived at the office early, my laptop in my bag, a neatly organized folder of recordings ready to be presented. I had scheduled a private meeting with HR, framing it as a routine discussion about workplace challenges, to ensure Mark would have no prior warning. The sense of anticipation was almost tangible, but I kept my exterior calm, composed, and professional. As I entered the HR office, I took a deep breath and reminded myself to focus on clarity and structure. This wasn't a confrontation fueled by emotion. It was an execution of a carefully thought-out plan. I began by calmly outlining the pattern of behavior I had endured, describing specific instances without embellishment, always maintaining a tone of measured professionalism. HR listened attentively, taking notes, occasionally exchanging brief, concerned glances. I knew I had their attention, but I also knew that words alone would not suffice. It was the recordings that would deliver the undeniable proof. When I began presenting the recordings, I made sure to do so in a logical sequence. I started with minor instances of undermining, gradually escalating to the most egregious examples. The public humiliation during client presentations, the laughter at my expense, the repeated theft of credit for my work. Each recording was annotated, with context, dates, and notes on the participants, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. I watched HR's expressions change subtly, the polite skepticism giving way to recognition and concern as the evidence unfolded. It was a powerful moment. Hearing Mark's own voice, his laughter, his condescending tone, the words he thought were harmless or clever, laid bare for scrutiny. There was a sense of vindication that I had not expected to feel so acutely. Every insult, every attempt to diminish me now worked against him. I remained composed, allowing the evidence to speak louder than any emotional outburst could. My calm demeanor only strengthened the impact, showing that I had not acted impulsively, but strategically and methodically. HR asked questions, clarifying details, ensuring that the context was fully understood. I answered each with precision, emphasizing the consistent pattern of behavior rather than isolated incidents. By the time the final recording played, the one in which he openly mocked my professionalism during a high-stakes client meeting, the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The power dynamic had inverted. Mark's arrogance, carefully documented, had become his own undoing. Finally, I summarized the evidence, laying out the chronological progression and the cumulative impact of his actions. I made it clear that my intent was not to retaliate out of personal spite, but to hold him accountable for behavior that had been unethical, unprofessional, and damaging to both myself and the company. The recordings were irrefutable, the pattern undeniable. I could feel the tension in the room ease slightly as HR acknowledged the gravity of the situation and the sufficiency of the evidence. By the end of the meeting, the path forward was clear. HR assured me that immediate steps would be taken, including a review of Mark's conduct, notification of relevant management, and a suspension pending investigation. The first phase of justice had been executed flawlessly. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This was more than vindication. It was a turning point, the moment where careful planning and patience finally bore fruit. The confrontation came sooner than Mark expected. HR called him into a private meeting while I remained nearby, a silent observer of the unfolding reckoning. I could see him walk down the corridor, his usual confident stride replaced by a subtle tension that betrayed unease. He had no idea what was coming, no inkling that the very arrogance he wielded so freely had created his own trap. When HR played the recordings, the change was immediate and striking. His smug expression faltered, replaced by disbelief, then rapidly gave way to panic. The laughter that had once fueled his sense of superiority now echoed back as undeniable proof of his misconduct. He stammered, attempted to deny the words he had spoken, claimed humor had been misunderstood, but every clip revealed the truth, clear, unambiguous, and damning. I watched as his reactions shifted from shock to anger. He leaned forward, voice rising, attempting to assert control, but it was too late. HR remained calm, methodical, and unyielding. They had listened to every clip, reviewed every note, and now they were holding him accountable in real time. The power that Mark had exercised so freely over months evaporated instantly, replaced by the realization that he was powerless to explain away his behavior. The irony of it all was almost poetic. Every tactic he had used to belittle me, to control narratives, to appear superior in front of clients and colleagues was now weaponized against him. His own words, recorded without his knowledge, became the evidence of his downfall. He tried to argue, tried to shift blame, but the clarity of the recordings left no room for dispute. HR had the leverage. Mark had none. By the end of the meeting, the decision was made. He was suspended immediately pending further investigation, his influence within the company effectively neutralized. Colleagues who had once feared his temper breathed a quiet sigh of relief, the atmosphere in the office shifting as word of his suspension spread. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from the sense of justice delivered with precision. The confrontation was complete. Mark's fall from the position of power he had wielded so carelessly was swift and undeniable. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that arrogance and cruelty are self-destructive when met with patience, strategy, and incontrovertible evidence. I had been patient, I had been meticulous, and I had acted at the perfect moment. The consequences he faced were entirely of his own making, and the poetic justice was unmistakable. The final payoff was more satisfying than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about Mark's suspension, it was about witnessing the full consequences of his arrogance and cruelty unfold, and knowing that my strategic patience had orchestrated it. The company moved quickly. After reviewing the recordings and corroborating accounts from colleagues, HR formally terminated Mark's employment. The news rippled through the office. Whispers of disbelief, nods of quiet approval, and subtle smiles of relief. He had gone from a figure of authority and intimidation to someone publicly accountable for months of toxic behavior. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very actions he had used to assert control over me and others had created the unshakable evidence that destroyed his career. I remember the day the official notice was posted. I walked past the office where he once held court, now empty and silent. The aura of intimidation he had cultivated for so long had vanished, replaced by a quiet sense of normalcy. Colleagues I had once worried about reaching out to me now offered congratulations, smiles, and subtle nods of respect. It was a reminder that my work and professionalism had endured, and that justice could be executed with patience, intelligence, and precision. But the satisfaction went deeper than mere professional vindication. Every time I replayed the recordings in my mind, not for personal gratification, but as a testament to the truth, I felt a sense of closure. Months of humiliation, anxiety, and self-doubt had been transformed into evidence of resilience and strategic thinking. I had turned what could have been a career-defining humiliation into a story of justice and empowerment. There was also the moral satisfaction of seeing karma deliver a fitting consequence. Mark had relied on arrogance, cruelty, and the belief that no one would dare challenge him. In the end, those traits had led directly to his downfall. The poetic symmetry of it was undeniable. He had mocked me, undermined me, and stolen credit for my work, and each act of toxicity had been recorded, cataloged, and presented as proof of his own undoing. That final day also marked a new chapter in my professional life. Freed from the shadow of Mark's intimidation, I found renewed confidence in my abilities. My colleagues' respect was no longer cautious or hesitant. It was genuine acknowledgement of my expertise, patience, and strategic thinking. I could lead meetings, present ideas, and manage projects without the lingering anxiety that had once shadowed every interaction. Looking back, I realized the real victory wasn't just in Mark's downfall, but in reclaiming my own power. I had been patient, observant, and methodical. I had leveraged knowledge, documentation, and foresight to turn humiliation into a strategic advantage. And the most satisfying part? Justice had been delivered in a way that was undeniable, fair, and perfectly aligned with the principle that those who wield cruelty as a weapon often become ensnared by it themselves. The aftermath of Mark's downfall was a profound relief and a period of quiet reflection. With him gone, the workplace atmosphere shifted dramatically. Meetings were no longer tinged with fear or tension, and colleagues began to speak openly, collaborate freely, and share ideas without hesitation. The constant undercurrent of anxiety that had colored every interaction evaporated almost overnight. I could feel the difference not just in the office, but in myself, a sense of liberation and empowerment that was deeply satisfying. HR and management made it clear that Mark's behavior was unacceptable, and his termination sent a strong message to the rest of the company. Toxic conduct, arrogance, and public humiliation would not be tolerated. His career, once carefully constructed on intimidation and manipulation, had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. It was a stark lesson in accountability and the power of evidence-based justice. The irony of his downfall, his own, cruelty captured and used against him, was not lost on anyone. For me personally, life returned to a sense of normalcy that was richer than before. I no longer carried the daily dread of being undermined or mocked. Instead, I carried the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered a storm with patience, intelligence, and integrity. My work flourished, my relationships with colleagues strengthened, and I even began taking on more leadership responsibilities, knowing that I had earned not only respect, but authority through resilience and strategic thinking. The recordings that had been my unique weapon were now a symbol of empowerment, a reminder that careful observation, documentation, and thoughtful action can turn even the most oppressive situations into opportunities for justice. I often reflected on the journey, from the initial humiliation, through the rising tension, to the meticulously executed plan, and finally, the ultimate vindication. Each stage reinforced the lesson that arrogance and cruelty have consequences, and that strategic patience can transform vulnerability into power. Mark, in the months following his termination, became a cautionary tale within professional circles. His reputation, once bolstered by fear and superficial charm, was irrevocably damaged. Colleagues who had once admired or feared him now viewed him with a mix of disbelief and judgment. In contrast, I emerged not only intact, but stronger, with my credibility and professional integrity fully intact. The narrative had shifted completely. I was no longer the one being undermined. I was the one who had ensured justice was served. Looking back, the moral of this story is clear. Patience, intelligence, and strategic action are far more powerful than reactive anger or impulsive retaliation. By observing, documenting, and planning, I was able to turn a moment of humiliation into a decisive and satisfying victory. The toxic force that had once controlled the narrative had been neutralized, and my life returned to a new normal. One defined not by fear, but by empowerment, respect, and the undeniable satisfaction of seeing justice delivered in a way that was perfectly earned. The workplace had changed, but more importantly, I had changed. I understood now that resilience and foresight are not just survival tools, they are instruments of justice. And in that knowledge, I found both closure and a renewed sense of purpose.